Lovely. Well, hello everyone. It's really nice to have so many people on the call. Really busy stage of term, and yeah, the more the merrier in terms of chipping in with ideas and things that have worked for you or things that you find hard, so we could sort of source some of the best ideas and think about how to solve things. I'm going to be talking about vocab acquisition because, of course, we have different levels: Key Stage 3, we have GCSE, we have A level, and each of those has its particular unique demands. We also have Latin, we have Greek. I suppose there's also the question of the vocabulary around key terms for Class C or ancient history too. So maybe some of these things might apply there, although I'll specifically be talking about language today. So I've deliberately sort of kept it quite broad brush the next half hour or so in terms of the guiding ideas I think are important about vocab learning and vocab teaching, and then a few examples of how that then manifests in the classroom. But of course, these things could then be applied to whatever key stage or subject. Apologies if you've seen me talk about vocab or language before. I'm going to repeat some of the things I probably said in previous years, but probably the well of new ideas is probably running a little bit dry in my brain. So I guess my ideas have sort of developed over the past decade or so of my teaching, and probably solidified. But I'll be grateful for any more creative ideas from any of you as we go along. So I'm a classics teacher and an assistant head director of studies at St Albans High School for Girls. I'm also just this year taking over as one of the two co-chairs of the CATB, so the Classical Association Teaching Board. That means that if you have an issue about classics teaching or an opportunity for us to do something different or develop in any way to do with the teaching of classics, I'm very happy to be a sounding board or to sort of forward your ideas or collate things. So to do feel free to get in touch. My email address is on the screen. Okay, so vocab acquisition. I think it's really important, and hopefully this dovetails a lot with what Julie's just been talking about with cognitive load. It's important to think about what the students are faced with. Now, I've put here vocab in the abstract. Let's remember, let's say GCSE Latin. Let's remember what they face in years 10 and 11. They're doing one of, say, 10 different GCSE subjects. For them, a vocab list of 450 words is actually potentially quite daunting. We think as teachers, it's really, we can think as teachers, it's really short and decline and fall, and it used to be 1,000 in my day, and 20 years ago it was 700 million, and they should know all these words from when they start learning Latin in the womb type thing. Now, there is a risk of forgetting the scale of the challenge for sort of students, and thinking about the alienness of a lot of the words that in Latin and Greek they've got to come across. Also, the fact that they're not, it's a different beast from MFL in that these words are not on their lips a lot and in their ears a lot, even in the classroom, even if we can try and introduce activities which get them speaking and listening occasionally. So the process is quite different cognitively, and therefore 400 words is quite a challenge. It's also quite a challenge if you present a vocab list in the form that say is on the screen now, just the sort of A to Z. Not that there is any Zs, I think, in the Latin GCSE vocab list. The A to Z vocab list with all its constituent parts and mixed up by parts of speech, and you've got verbs and nouns all sorts together. And if you were just to say, go away and learn the A's and learn the B's, learn the C's, I mean, you can do that, and if necessary, you maybe haven't got huge amounts of time, you might have to do that. But it's not necessarily the best, I think, most effective way to introduce vocab and approach vocab along the course of, say, a GCSE couple of years. So yeah, rather than with sort of hand wringing of it's only 400 words, we think about it's actually 400 of those words. Some of them are quite easy, and others are really quite hard. Lots will have what might seem to a teacher a fairly obvious English derivative, and it might be that you get lucky and you have students in your class who have well-developed English vocabulary and they can spot that. But it might be that there aren't, where they find English harder. It might be that their reading is lower in English, and therefore their basic sort of literacy doesn't allow those simple links with the derivatives. Also, you might get lucky and have students in your classroom who've got the MFL, French or Spanish, for example, to compare with, but you may well not. So we must remember at the outset the scale of the challenge. Right, so we've got vocab in the abstract. I think a lot of this is potentially quite daunting if there's no obvious English derivative. And I say obvious with that caveat, which I just mentioned in mind, it could be obvious to the teacher, but not to the student. Also, if words might seem a bit alien, for example, adeo. I mean, in the middle of that list there, it's not very easy to remember. It doesn't give us an English root, obviously, and it also has multiple potential meanings there. So thinking about which one is the hardest or which one is the most appropriate in a context is also tricky. But the big thing about vocab in the abstract, and the big problem of vocab lists, as sort of in the OCR list here, is that there's a fixation on the left-hand column. So with your verb absum, you learn absum, but actually that's not what you see in the wild, if you like. And the next slide is something that I've shown before and used for sort of different purposes. But a couple of years ago, I did a sort of word cloud or a word frequency analysis of all the words which we'd put into the first edition of Latin Stories about sort of 10 years ago, out of interest really to sample what does actually occur more often than not. Now, I realise I'm breaking Julie's rule about don't put too much on a slide, but I thought I'd show the slide so that you can do a screen grab or what have you, and then when Grania shares the slide, you can have the list here. But the point of this was to illustrate, and I give this to students, to illustrate that what comes up in stories is not necessarily just that left-hand column of a vocab list. Now that works in various ways. I mean, firstly, thinking about the frequency of words which are most hit, and on that left-hand side there, you can see it's the little words that are very frequent. They're the kind of glue of any Latin unseen, for example. It's got your connectives, your relatives, your pronouns. The little words pose their own problem in terms of vocab because they're often not obviously linked to an English word. They don't have an easy memory hook. And therefore, coming back to these again and again and again is really vital, and the repetition is really vital. But then, and this is more for the purposes of today, thinking about, say, how our verbs actually appear in passages, well, you don't get first person, present tense, active, indicative appearing very often at all. In a Latin passage, you might have that only in direct speech if you have a character saying what they're up to right now. So that left-hand column for our verbs, for example, absum, is much less likely to come up than, say, the third person and various past tenses. And I think we need to factor this into our vocab teaching and our vocab learning, because we need to teach inflected forms and also test, I think, inflected forms too. Likewise with nouns, you're going to see the accusative, not maybe quite as often as the nominative, but you'll see it very often. And so you need to be able to spot that, and that's easy enough quite a lot of the time, but it might be harder if, say, the accusative is a plural. And training, therefore, students for that is really important. Now, how does this feed into what we actually do in terms of vocab in the classroom? So I think, and again, sort of dovetailing with Julie, I think vocab learning and teaching needs to be explicit, and it needs to be deliberate. Now, what I mean by that is I will have no hesitation in spending the best part of a lesson discussing and actually teaching the vocab in good detail. Actually, say, going through a vocab list, if you want, say, your year 10s to learn a set list of words, not just setting it obliquely as a sort of a homework, or your homework is to learn these 30 words, but it's such an essential part of the subject and of the process of unpicking a Latin passage that it needs to be receiving the time in class to prepare the students for maybe potentially the context in which that vocab might appear, B, any particular quirks about the vocab, C, thinking about derivatives and memory hooks, and for words which don't have an easy derivative, discussing as a group of students how they might find a funny way to remember a word is really, really valuable. you're also, and I'll come onto this in a sec, able to link it with the actual, the vocab they see in the wild and some of the grammar forms they might actually see, not just the left-hand column. So when you're learning vocab, I think an excellent way to do it is by part of speech. And you can do that even in Key Stage 3. You can be, right here, learn your verbs or learn your nouns or learn your adjectives, because it allows a linked conversation in the classroom about the grammar and therefore the forms that the students are likely to see. I mean, this isn't to make vocab learning really austere and really, really tough. It's more from a perspective of training them for what they're going to find in a passage when ultimately on exam day or just for any translation, they're actually going to experience the vocab. So it's about preparation and preempting for the particular context as the general rule of thumb. So in this list, for example, which I'd give to, say, year 10s, right, we're going to this week be learning our first conjugation verbs, many of which they might have seen before in year 7, 8, or 9 in some capacity. So firstly, a reassuring thing is lots of these words are revision. But what are the types of conversations you might have in a, say, 20-minute, 30-minute discussion about this list, a vocab teaching lesson? Well, firstly, if you do list all the principal parts, you might spot that one verb is listed as plus dative. Let's remind ourselves why that's a bit surprising, because most verbs take an accusative direct object. We might have a separate list later on of various verbs that do take a dative. We might highlight any irregular principal parts and think, what's tricky here in terms of our perfect tenses? We've got deady down there from dome, and that's probably harder to spot maybe than do, or it's more common certainly than do. So let's not forget that. You might add in asterisks, anything that's particularly important about a word, like pronoun with its deponent sense there. You might also talk about some second meanings. Are there situations when cogito might be better translated as consider rather than think? Or are there false friends? Curo, for example, not really meaning cure, but it gives us obviously cure. And that's a conversation for, say, this right-hand column. What are the English derivatives we can spot for these words? A lot of them are going to help with our vocab acquisition, but there might be some false friends too. Are there any vocab links in modern languages that students might spot? All of this is preparing for vocab and introducing kind of different types of conversations, which I think help preempt. But crucially, I think it's useful to teach and learn by part of speech. So here I've listed your first conjugation verbs on the EDUCAS, because then that allows a linked conversation about the grammar. And again, this isn't to beat students over the head with the task and make it really, really tough. It's designed to preempt and prepare them for what they actually then see when they have a passage. At this point, I think in year 10, we hadn't learnt the future tense, so hence I put it on the back of a sheet here. This was on the back of the same A4 page, but I left the blank columns there, and I got them just to jot in as best as they could remember the endings they'd learnt for the present, imperfect, perfect, and pluperfect for the first conjugation. Because then I said, well, in the test we're going to have in a week or two's time, there will be some inflected forms, because these are the type you're going to see routinely, and therefore these are the type you're going to have to be able to handle. This then is treating grammar and vocab not as two unlinked things and two different challenges, but it's saying your vocab is your main, your kind of air in the tires, if you like, but spotting them in context is going to be the hardest cognitive thing. And therefore we need to treat the two together, because we're going to see inflected forms far more than nominatives. What does then, say, a test look like? And by the way, you can apply this for Key Stage 3 or for A-level as well. What might a test look like? Well, I think it's important to test for vocab, again, in different ways to reinforce the kind of conversations you've had in the classroom, but also to slightly preempt for the versatility with which vocab needs to be handled. So, for example, you might have some questions which are just straight translation, both ways around, mind, Latin to English and English to Latin, not necessarily because you're going to have more than 10 marks in the GCSE for English to Latin, but because it's so good cognitively, and as a revision exercise, it's excellent to do it and to secure that vocab the other way around too. You might ask them to give a derivative, and that is, of course, preparing for something they might see in an exam. But then, crucially, you might want to have inflected forms. So you can make this as difficult or as easy as you want, whether or not you include participles, for example, or different tenses. All of those are obviously from the vocab list they've learned, plus a range of endings. And between that, you can select forms which you want them to maybe revise more, and maybe a class needs work on particular X or Y. But crucially, it's reminding students that you're not just going to see that first column, you're going to see them appearing in diverse forms, and 95% of the time they're not in that first column form. Then second part of a test might also, and this is quite, I guess, unusual in a vocab test, but it might also have a few grammar questions connected with that part of speech. And this is the beauty, I think, of doing grammar and vocab slightly in tandem, or at least selecting your vocab in a way that reinforces the grammar. Because as you're revising your first conjugation verbs, you might be saying, well, remember that we're looking out for an A in the endings, and remember, therefore, that the ending is going to be RA in the infinitive, and we're looking at RBAM in the imperfect. So we're marrying up the grammar and vocab process. I think that makes the grammar seem less mystifying, and it prepares them again for how the vocab will manifest in an eventual passage, thereby making it seem more explicable rather than some sort of weird, curious magic where the vocab suddenly appears in all these forms. And then a vocab test might also include some short sentences, where, because it's the big thing about vocab, is some students are very good at learning a list, maybe that left-hand column. Some students may be very good at learning the list, plus also being able to think about the inflected forms, and others might really struggle with that. And so therefore vocab in context might give some a real hook. So for example, in these short sentences, I've got a couple of verbs in each of them. And you can decide whether you're marking just for the verbs or you're marking the whole sentence. But it's about it's about contextualizing the vocab, I suppose, and making it more akin to what they're going to have to deal with in a passage. And then, based on what Julie was saying as well, in a vocab test, remember what you learned in the last vocab test, because it's all too easy, isn't it, for them to cram for one for a week and then forget the stuff the next week. So you might want to slip in some recap. And I think the previous week I'd obviously done comparatives, but also adjectives and sort of scale and adjectives linked to result clauses, talis and tot and tantus, for example. So all of that is slightly diversifying the task of teaching vocab, but also testing vocab. And I think it does pay off. In terms of general principles, I think vocab, as cognitive load theory suggests, and as Julie was saying, you need to think about consolidation to the point of almost mastery. So that, remember, it's that the vocab is probably not the hardest thing they're going to have to deal with in a Latin passage or a Greek passage. The hardest thing they're going to have to deal with in that is spotting all the endings and making sense of them, linked to the bedrock of the vocab. Hopefully they know. So you want to develop a sort of mastery of the vocab as much as possible, so that it takes up less of a part of their attention during the actual examination. So when you're giving example sentences about, say, a grammar construction, much better to stick to a known bit of vocab they know, even if it's a bit boring after a while when you've got houses and soldiers and dogs, and all sorts. Using the same vocab at least focuses on the grammar point in question, but also helps reinforce that vocab. You want to pick translation passages for practice, and course books, which have, I think, a really high percentage of known vocab. In my school this year, we've switched from CLC to De Romanis, which obviously some of you might have done, might not have done, might approve of, might not. But one of the really strong points of the way the stories are designed in De Romanis, for example, is the fact that they really hammer a relatively narrow pool of vocab, which builds up a level of mastery on those certain words. What that means also is that in the sentences and in the translation passages, then the little tweaks are ones of grammar, and it's practicing spotting those changes rather than always scrabbling for a piece of vocab that is not necessarily always very relevant. How else can we build in high frequency encounters? Well, we can think about little lesson starters. Put 5 words up on the board each time, and it takes 2 minutes for them to scribble those down, or just even think about them in their heads, or tell their neighbor. Those could be words that are really easy, For confidence, it could be words that are quite tricky and they've come up, say, in a task that you've set them in terms of sentences or a passage that have caught people out. So it could be a challenging little starter, or it could be a confidence boost. But it's about getting those words in front of their eyes as frequently as possible. It might be that you spotted that certain items are less stickable, if you like, or less sticky. So it might be irregular verbs, ewit, for example, or essay. They need repeated hammering, and they're introduced often in course books quite early on, and therefore they're going to be very frequent, but doesn't necessarily, without explicit recapping, make them more sticky. It might be that there are quick vocab games. You can end up doing Latin charades for 5 minutes where the answers are in Latin, and the kids have to be silent and think of the answers before they put their hands up. And again, the wrong answers there are just as good as the right answers, because you can say, "Oh, the wrong answer. Oh, you were thinking of this word." Again, it's getting this vocab through their brains as often as possible, and all of it's aimed at making them more automatic in their spotting of vocab in a passage, because the focus needs to be really on the endings and the cases, especially for nouns, and the tense and person for verbs. But it should also build up some confidence and some progress. And again, we might say, "Oh, but we're always dealing with a limited pool of vocab, and isn't it sad that we don't want to go completely, we can't go completely off piste?" But again, put yourself in the student's perspective and thinking about building confidence. Other broad strategies. I'm conscious of about sort of 7 or 8 minutes left. Now, it does help, I think, when students are often revising for exams, or maybe especially at A level, when, as we know, there's famously no DVL, thinking about how can they glean as they go along, and how can they personalize what they find easy and hard, for example. So I tend to give either a notebook or sometimes they now prefer like an online document to say exam classes. And he might set a task, e.g., right, go through the vocab list and write down your hardest 20 words. I've put an example there of we're, and that's how I want them to write it out. I want them to write out the grammar details. I want them to think about the theme of it, because that's, again, preempting what types of context the words might appear in a passage. And it might be that there's a pattern appearing there because they actually find the military vocab really hard, or they might find another type of vocab really easy, for example. Is there an important second meaning of a word? I think it's a really neglected and really interesting thing to do, is to think about choosing the right translation, because 60% of the time we might mean man, but sometimes it's important when it means husband that it means husband. And there are lots of examples like that. So a list of like second meanings would be very interesting to do. But this is particularly, of course, interesting or useful maybe at A level when, in the absence of a DVL, as you're reading a story, it might be that they can have a document on the go as like a vocab builder. So they are gradually doing a modern version of a notebook, for example. I should say I can see that people have put things in the chat, but I can't yet see the actual comments. So sorry if you feel like I'm neglecting you, but I'll hopefully come back in a minute and answer some other questions. There are ways to make vocab revision quite creative. I think I set this as a task for some year 10s or 11s a few years ago. And I said, can you go through the vocab list? And we're not going to do a full like prose composition, English into Latin paragraph, but I would like you to pick out words that you could use if you were doing a story about. And then I gave them complete free choice of story. And one student picked an unsuccessful heist, and went to the vocab list. And I sort of said, right, have like 5 bullet points, if you like, 5 sentences maybe. And what words could you use if you were a GCSE unseen set writer? What words would you use from the vocab list, which make sense together? Now, that's a way of revising lots of words quickly, because as they look through the vocab list, of course, there are words that they might not choose to put in this. And this was just one homework. But of course, then they're thinking about the words that do go naturally quite well together. And they're also preparing for context of how words might appear within a passage. For example, it's quite common for them to see pecunia and habere, had lots of money. Now, this student put the word gens in the villa. They're probably there lived a rich. I think they're probably aiming at person. And then you might think, well, I haven't edited this. Then you might think, well, what do you mean by person? Is it gens? I think, what word have you looked up there? And would it be better to have another word for person? Would it be better to have vir or homo, for example, or femina, for example? And that itself prompts an interesting conversation. Then this person was deciding to enter the house in the middle of the night, Median Nocte, so they put in like a little ablative phrase there. But they had to be quick, and they wanted to find the money in the kitchen, and they're escaping. But alas, there's someone says thief, and the thief falls down, and they make a shout, and the dogs and the guards hear. And it's quite a quick way of revising lots of vocab. And you could do this at Key Stage 3 or GCSE and A level. So a bit of a fun way to cover a lot of vocab quickly. Finally, for A level, what sort of things might be useful? Because of course, it's a very daunting thing potentially to say, well, anything goes beyond the AS list, where which is our kind of foundation. What sort of things could we look at? I think there is a risk of slogging through too many vocab lists at A level, and I think that has a sort of diminishing return because as useful the use of their time might be to practice spotting words that you can guess at because they link to words that maybe you've seen before, or again, maybe there's an English derivative, but thinking about also patterns of words. So, for example, at A level, if they can recognize lots of common suffixes, third declension abstracts like artio or itas or estas, or if they can recognize that or is that regular suffix for a doer of a thing, which they've been learning all the way through from an imperator and gladiator, but it might appear with a different noun attached to it at the before the ending there. That's a really useful skill. Ulus with diminutives, or ficus, making things fair and gare, people who carry things, or osis, adjectival forms. In a way, there's the sort of skill of practicing spotting types of words as well as just plowing through loads and loads of lists. And I think that's useful at A level. When you haven't got a vocab list, what do you do? Well, with A level, we know, and this is more or less parallel for Greek as well, that you've got your AS list and your extras, and say at the back of Latin Beyond, that gives about 1,200. There's a separate verse list in Latin Beyond and Greek Beyond that takes you to about 1,500. After that, I think there is a risk of diminishing returns. And is it better to practice sensible guesses? Probably, in my opinion, yes, rather than to try and learn umpteen words and aim at 2,000 or 2,500. I think that's not very realistic in terms of time. And I think better to say, well, there might well be the odd word that you're going to have to make an educated guess at. And problematic as that is, maybe in terms of the specification, but better that than saying, right, we're going to learn 2,500 words to cover all bases. But that said, if you want to extend, there are different ways to extend. There are little vocab books. This is a good one, basic Latin vocab, which lists words often by cognates, and that's lists beautiful sort of families of words there. And there is obviously the old AQA A-level list as well. There is a brilliant website which, if any of you are responsible for, I don't know who is responsible for, but thank you very much. It has classictuition.com, which I haven't discovered very long ago. Now this pulls together loads of different vocab lists and has them on the sortable by word type and by English and Latin and source. But what it does, I've got here the A-level Latin one on the screen. What it does is it pulls together the AS list plus the extras and beyond, plus the old AQA list, plus the 300, and that gives about 1,900 words. I mean, I think that's probably still probably more than you might be able to get through, but it's a good sort of basis. One or two final thoughts about what to try and cover. Think about those second meanings of words, because there are famous examples like manus is it 99% of the time it's a hand, but occasionally it's a band of men. So then that's an important difference. Insula really does occasionally mean block of flats, very rarely, but it can do, and it's worth then being aware of those. But also going back to the idea of asking students what they find hardest, because especially if you've got a relatively small group in year 11 or year 13, that you can then personalize vocab tests as well. And you can say, well, we'll do a vocab test on page 1 or 2, but also I'm going to introduce 5 words from the list that you've given me and you've prepared for me in terms of the ones you find tricky. It's 11 o'clock, so I better stop there. And sorry, Granny, I've probably overrun and not left time for discussion. Shall I try and address some of the chat questions?
So thanks, Henry. That was a really fab presentation. I think actually a lot of the comments in the chat, if you just have a quick look,
Yeah,
were
I've found them. I've seen them now. Yeah.
a conversation between people that are also watching this.
Awesome.
This was fab.
Yeah, so grouping words by theme is very helpful for um, preparing them mentally for the types of context in which words might well appear. Um, and it's actually the easiest way to think about this as a teacher, or to realize this, is if you say pick a verb and you're trying to write a sentence in Latin or Greek, there aren't that many words sometimes it can go naturally with. How many different things can you do with epistula apart from read, carry, lose, hide? Some, not many things. Um, but you can also extend that to think about themes. So yeah, military, religious, family, and one beauty of the list I've put there, the Dickinson core vocab list, is that it does actually have a sortable column by theme. But also, as you're getting students to write their own list of tricky ones, which is there, you might ask them to think about, yeah, what theme does this tap into? And do you find a particular theme harder? Obviously, with A-level Latin and Livy, you're going to have loads of military words. The comprehension could be all sorts of things, though. It could be essentially a memory of lost loved one, so vocab to do with love, or it could be a question of justice. Pliny writing to Trajan saying, "Is this a just thing to do?" And lots of vocab to do with justice might crop up. But I think then yeah, preparation by theme does help to prepare for that type of situation. And there's been a brilliant link shared in the chat of thematic GCSE Latin vocab. Thank you very much. Great. I'm going to stop sharing there. Hopefully that was useful. Sorry if it was money for old rape. And they were teaching people things that are pretty obvious. Yeah, if anyone has any questions, then feel free to ping me an email or ask me now. Otherwise, Grania, back to you.
Thanks, Henry. Does anyone have any questions that they'd like to ask Henry now? Much like with Julie, we will, of course, I will obviously circulate any links that Henry has shared, and he's obviously also shared his email address, so he'd be very happy for, well, I'm speaking on Henry's behalf here, but I think we'd be very happy for you to contact him directly. Okay.